Hello and welcome to our next chapter. It's chapter 10 in BCOM titled Managing Data and Using Graphics. What we're talking about in this chapter is taking a wealth of data and information and reducing it to a common language or to a summary of the material that our readers can understand very clearly. So there are computer programs that will help us reduce raw data into statistical means by which we can manage that data well, or we can process the data and reduce it down to very simple terms such as portions and ratios, which makes it easy for an audience to understand them. Then that audience can make comparisons between those proportions and ratios and don't have to wade through a lot of raw data and raw information. This is referred to as common language, taking the wealth of material we have and reducing it to sources of information that the people can understand. What we want to do is make sure that communication is effectively produced, and so we do that by trying to make it easy for our audience to understand it. In terms of using the graphics, there are several different rules, and you'll see these rules on page 163 of your textbook. Let me go over these rules just very briefly so that we have a clear understanding of them. First of all, we have to ask ourselves, is a graphic really needed? Is it necessary for people to have this wealth of information and raw data reduced into a graphic so that they can fully understand it? If we could use words to express it clearer, then don't use a graphic. But if a graphic is needed, then we need to create something that helps to communicate our information to our readers. The second question that we need to ask and point that we need to make is, does the graphic presentation contribute to the overall understanding of the data? The problem is we don't want to confuse our readers in any way. We want to create information that is easy for them to understand and easy for them to make sense of and to make decisions with. And so what we want to ask ourselves is if our graphic will help the reader understand the information. If it doesn't, then we need to go back to using words again. The third question the textbook raises is the graphic easily understood? Now, of course, we'll have to explain that graphic. We want people to really fully understand all that it says. But for most readers, a graphic should be fairly clear and easily discernible, even on their own. There are three points and tips here related to making a graphic easily understood. First of all, avoid chart junk, and you can see the definition of that in your textbook, where we throw so much information in terms of graphics to a person that our page becomes complicated and confusing. The second point is to use a consistent design, one that once our readers get used to it, they can feel comfortable with it and relate to it. And third, using meaningful titles for people to understand the information in the graphic. The title will give the reader an understanding, an initial understanding of what the graphic is about. And so the use of good titles is absolutely critical with graphics. And if we do that, we help the reader to understand the material. So the third question we're asking is the graphic easily understood? A fourth question, and this borders into the ethical issues, is the graphic honest? Are we distorting the graphic and thus making some deceptive statements for the reader? The textbook will help to clarify this for you, but we have to be very careful when we do a graphic that it creates an accurate perception in the mind of the reader of what is actually being said by the raw data. We must be honest and ethical in all of our communication, and in many ways, the graphic is an easy way for people to say what they want to say without truly demonstrating what the raw data is saying. When we create a graphic, we must be very certain that it is truthful and ethical. And then finally, can a graphic used in a presentation be seen by the entire audience? This has to do with not just the creation of the graphic, but the presentation of the graphic. Is the font size large enough for people to see? Are the colors clear enough and distinct enough? Is the graphic itself large enough that it can be seen from every corner of the room? These are simply questions we have to ask ourselves in terms of preparing something that can be adequately and properly presented to people. The textbook goes on then to talk about the types of graphic aids, and this is something you must look at the textbook for in terms of discriminating clearly between the different kinds of graphic aids, and there are a number of them. The textbook starts with tables, and then it moves to different kinds of charts, the bar chart, the line chart, and the pie chart. It also moves then into maps and flow charts, and then a few others. Now, these 5 or 6 different distinctions of graphic aids are very important for you to understand, and the different kinds of graphic aids underneath each of them, so that you have a clear understanding not only of the types of graphic aids that you may use for your report, but also how to use those correctly for the kind of information that you have. You should be able to recognize that you have a certain kind of information and be able to discern from the type of information you have what kind of graphic aid you need. So take a look at this section of the textbook, read over it so that you have a clear understanding of these different types of graphic aids. Finally, on page 170, you'll see how we use the graphic aid within the text. And there are 3 different steps that we follow here to create a pattern for introducing graphic aids. The first is to introduce the graphic aid. The second is to show the graphic aid. And then the third is to interpret or to analyze the graphic aid. And it simply makes sense. You don't want to present the graphic before you introduce it, or it will distract people. They'll spend time looking at it and trying to say, well, what does this mean? So you introduce it first, and then you show it to people, and then you begin to explain what it means. Obviously, if there's not enough room on the page for the graphic aid to fit after you've introduced it, put the graphic aid onto the next page. So you might actually start introducing it and then analyzing it before people see it when they turn to the next page. But that's the best pattern for using the text and the graphic aid. This is just a brief overview of Chapter 10. But the bulk of the work will have to be done by you when you take a look at the different kinds of graphic aids that can be used and the kinds of information that they help to convey. Understand that this is just a brief overview of the text. You're going to have to read the text to fully understand it and be prepared for the exam. Thanks for joining me. I look forward to seeing you when we come back together for the next chapter.